Three shadows moved through the darkness of a quiet Alexandria street, their eyes locked on a single-story brick house where a solitary light flickered behind lace curtains. Inside, a 72-year-old woman sat alone, seemingly defenseless, seemingly vulnerable. What these intruders didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that the frail figure they were about to confront had spent 30 years breaking the minds of terrorists, dismantling spy networks, and executing psychological operations that changed the course of history. Margaret Hartwell wasn't just any elderly woman living out her retirement in suburban Virginia. She was a weapon, forged in the cold fires of Cold War intelligence, sharpened through decades of CIA interrogations that would make hardened criminals weep. And tonight, as these three men prepared to cross her threshold with violence in their hearts, they were about to become subjects in an experiment they never volunteered for, a demonstration of how quickly predators can become prey when they wander into the wrong den. This isn't a story about a home invasion. This is a story about what happens when you threaten someone who has spent a lifetime learning exactly how to dismantle human psychology, piece by calculated piece. This is about the moment when three armed criminals realized they hadn't just broken into a house. They had walked into a trap that had been years in the making, set by a mind trained to see weakness, exploit fear, and turn enemies against themselves without firing a single shot. How does a woman in her 70s, armed with nothing but words and decades of classified experience, turn the tables on three violent intruders? How does the hunter become the hunted in the span of a single night? And what secrets lie hidden in the shadows of a career spent in the world's most dangerous profession? Stay with us, because what you're about to witness will challenge everything you thought you knew about power, vulnerability, and the invisible scars carried by those who served in silence. Margaret Hartwell had become a ghost long before she retired, not the kind that haunts, but the kind that moves through the world unnoticed, unremarkable, deliberately forgettable. That was exactly how she liked it. Her brick house on Colvin Street in Alexandria, Virginia, sat nestled between a young family with noisy children and a retired postal worker who spent his days tending roses. The neighborhood was the definition of American suburban tranquility. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained lawns, the occasional jogger passing by in the early morning light. Margaret fit the scenery perfectly. She was just another elderly woman, widowed, living alone, shuffling to the grocery store twice a week, attending the occasional church service, waving politely to neighbors who rarely gave her a second thought. But beneath that carefully cultivated exterior lived someone entirely different. From 1975 to 2005, Margaret Hartwell had been one of the CIA's most effective interrogators. She had worked in places whose names were redacted from official records, asked questions that unlocked secrets worth billions, and sat across tables from individuals whose very existence was classified. She had been in rooms in Afghanistan, Iraq, Eastern Europe, and locations that still, to this day, appeared on no map. She had learned to read micro-expressions before most people knew what they were, to identify deception in the space between heartbeats, to find the pressure point in any human psyche and press until it yielded exactly what she needed. She had interrogated warlords, double agents, sleeper cells, and ideologues. She had prevented attacks, identified moles, and extracted intelligence that saved countless lives. And she had done it all while maintaining the appearance of a mild-mannered analyst, a bureaucrat pushing papers in a Washington office. The agency had trained her well. Too well, perhaps, because even in retirement, even 7 years after she had turned in her credentials and signed her final non-disclosure agreement, Margaret couldn't turn off the training. She still scanned every room she entered for exits. She still profiled every stranger who held her gaze a second too long. She still maintained protocols, habits, and contingencies that would have seemed paranoid to anyone who hadn't lived the life she had. Her home reflected this invisible vigilance. To any visitor, it appeared to be the cluttered, comfortable residence of a grandmother. Family photos on the mantel, knitting supplies in a basket by the reading chair, a collection of porcelain figurines displayed in an antique cabinet. But Margaret knew the position of every object, every photograph, every seemingly random item. They formed a pattern, a system. If anything was moved, she would know. If anyone entered without her knowledge, the evidence would be there. She maintained a routine with military precision, though she made it appear casual. Morning walks at 7:15, grocery shopping on Tuesdays and Fridays, book club on the first Wednesday of each month, garden work on weekend afternoons. But within that routine she varied small details, the exact route of her walks, the specific time she left for the store, which entrance she used at the library. Old habits from a life where patterns got people killed. At 72, Margaret's body had aged, as all bodies do. Arthritis had begun to settle into her knuckles. Her knees protested on cold mornings. Her vision required reading glasses now, perched on the end of her nose whenever she opened a book. But her mind, that remained sharp as the day she had walked into CIA headquarters for her first assignment. Sharper, perhaps, refined by decades of experience, pattern recognition, and the kind of situational awareness that becomes second nature when your life has depended on it. She had been watching them for 3 days. The first time she noticed the dark blue sedan, it had been parked 2 blocks away, engine running, 2 figures visible in the front seats. The second time, it was in the grocery store parking lot, and she had observed one of the men, early 30s, athletic build, facial scar along the left jawline, watching her load bags into her car. The third time, just yesterday morning, she had spotted the vehicle again, this time with all 3 occupants visible. They were not professionals. That much was immediately clear. Professionals would never have been so careless with their surveillance. These were criminals, opportunists, probably looking for easy targets in the neighborhood. Elderly people living alone made perfect marks, predictable schedules, limited physical ability to resist, often too frightened or confused to provide useful information to police afterward. Margaret had spent that evening assessing her options. She could call the police, report suspicious activity. But what would she tell them? That she had noticed a car, that she felt watched. They would send a patrol car, the vehicle would disappear, and the men would simply move on to another target, another neighborhood, another victim. She could leave, spend a few weeks visiting her daughter in Boston until the threat passed. But Margaret Hartwell had not spent 3 decades facing down some of the world's most dangerous individuals, only to run from common street criminals in her own home. No. If they were coming, she would be ready. That night, as darkness settled over Alexandria and her neighbors turned off their lights one by one, Margaret made her preparations. She moved through her house with practiced efficiency, adjusting, positioning, preparing. To anyone else, the changes would have been invisible, but to her, they transformed her home into something else entirely, into terrain she controlled, into an environment where every advantage belonged to her. She changed into her nightgown at 10:30, exactly as she did every night. She turned off the living room lights at 11, right on schedule. She left a single lamp burning in her bedroom, visible from the street, maintaining the illusion of an old woman settling in for the night, vulnerable and alone. Then Margaret Hartwell sat in a chair positioned in the darkest corner of her living room, out of sight from any window, and she waited. Her breathing was calm, controlled, her heartbeat steady. She had done this before, in far more dangerous situations, in places where the stakes were infinitely higher. The difference was, those had been enemies of the state. These were simply men who had made a catastrophic error in judgment. They were going to break into her home tonight. She knew this with absolute certainty. She had read it in their surveillance patterns, in their increasing boldness, in the way they had moved from passive observation to active planning. And when they did, they would learn a lesson that Margaret had taught to countless others over 3 decades of classified service. The most dangerous opponent is not the one who looks dangerous, it's the one you underestimate. If you want to know what happens when 3 armed criminals walk into the trap of a lifetime, hit that subscribe button right now, leave a like, drop a comment, and share this video, because what's coming next will leave you absolutely stunned. This story is only beginning, and trust me when I say you cannot predict where it's going. The first window broke at 2:17 in the morning. Margaret heard the muffled crack of glass from the kitchen, followed by the careful scraping sounds of someone clearing away the remaining shards. She remained perfectly still in her chair, her breathing unchanged, her expression neutral. In the darkness of her living room she was invisible, a shadow among shadows. Amateur hour, she thought. Breaking a window was noisy, crude, the hallmark of criminals who relied on speed and intimidation rather than skill. Professionals would have found another way, picked a lock, exploited a weakness in the doorframe, perhaps even gained entry days earlier to unlock a window from the inside. She heard whispered voices, urgent and tense, 3 distinct speakers, exactly as she had anticipated. Jesus, Derek, that was loud as hell. The first voice was young, nervous, probably mid-20s. Shut up, Kyle. Everyone on this street is asleep. Just get through the window. This voice was older, more controlled, the obvious leader. Derek, then, the one with the scar she had noticed during her surveillance observations. I'm going. There's still glass. Then be careful, Travis, watch the street. Nothing moving, we're clear. Margaret's mind catalogued each voice, matching them to the physical descriptions she had memorized over the past 3 days. Derek, the leader, approximately 33 years old, 6 feet tall, 180 pounds, muscular build, moves with military bearing suggesting either service background or prison time. Kyle, the nervous one, mid-20s, slender, fidgety behavior indicating either drug use or naturally anxious disposition. Travis, the lookout, early 30s, medium build, quieter than the others, possibly more dangerous because of his composure. She heard the sound of someone climbing through the kitchen window, feet hitting the linoleum floor with a dull thud. Then a second person, then a third. They were inside. Check the bedrooms. Old lady should be sleeping. Derek's voice was barely a whisper now, closer than before. They were moving through her kitchen into the hallway that connected to the rest of the house. Margaret had positioned herself so that she could see the hallway entrance without being visible herself. She watched as a beam of light swept across the walls. They had flashlights then. Good. That would limit their night vision, while hers had been adjusted to the darkness for the past 4 hours. Derek, man, this place is creepy. Look at all these old photos. Kyle's voice held genuine unease. Focus. Find the jewelry, cash, anything valuable, and find the woman. They separated, exactly as she had anticipated. This was standard behavior for home invaders working in a group, split up to cover more ground quickly, maximize the surprise advantage, locate the residents before they could react or call for help. She heard Kyle moving toward the bedrooms. Travis headed for what he probably assumed was a home office or study. Derek remained in the main living area, his flashlight beam sweeping methodically across the space. The beam passed within 3 feet of where Margaret sat. She didn't move. Her years of training had taught her that human eyes were drawn to movement, not shapes in darkness. Remain still, control your breathing, become part of the environment. She had hidden from Taliban fighters in the mountains of Afghanistan using these same principles. Bedroom's empty, bed hasn't been slept in. Kyle's voice carried a new note of confusion from down the hallway. What? Derek's response was sharp, alert. I'm saying the old lady isn't here, bed's made, nobody's in it. Margaret heard Derek's footsteps moving quickly toward the bedroom, heard the whispered conversation between the 2 men. She could imagine Derek's thought process now, confusion leading to a reassessment, wondering if their surveillance had been wrong, if the target had gone somewhere, if they had broken into the wrong house. Maybe she's sleeping in another room. Travis's voice came from the study area, still calm, still focused. There's only 2 bedrooms in this place. I checked the second one, nobody there either. Bathroom, empty. Now uncertainty would be setting in. The confident invasion plan was encountering its first complication. They had expected to find a sleeping woman, easy to control, easy to intimidate into revealing where she kept her valuables. Instead, they had an empty house and no target. Margaret chose that moment to speak. Gentlemen, her voice was calm, conversational, completely devoid of fear. I believe you're looking for me. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. She heard Kyle yelp in surprise, Derek curse sharply, flashlight beams swinging wildly in her direction. Within seconds, all 3 beams had found her, illuminating the elderly woman, sitting calmly in a high-backed chair in the corner of her living room, hands folded in her lap, expression serene. How? Kyle was nearly hyperventilating. How long have you been sitting there? Derek had recovered his composure, but Margaret could hear the edge in his voice. This wasn't going according to his plan. Since you arrived, I heard you break my kitchen window at approximately 2:17. Quite loud, by the way. I'm surprised none of my neighbors called the police. She paused, allowing that information to sink in. Though I suppose at this hour, most people sleep rather soundly. Derek moved closer, and Margaret could see him clearly now in the ambient light from the multiple flashlights. The scar along his jaw was even more prominent up close, cutting through stubble that suggested he hadn't shaved in several days. His eyes were dark, calculating, trying to reassess the situation. You should have stayed in bed, lady. Would have made this a lot easier. I'm sure it would have. Unfortunately for you, I'm an extremely light sleeper, one of those unfortunate habits you develop when you've lived alone for a long time. She shifted slightly in her chair, a subtle movement that drew all three sets of eyes. Would one of you mind turning on the lamp? It's terribly difficult to have a proper conversation in the dark. We're not having a conversation. Derek pulled something from his jacket. A gun, Margaret noted with professional detachment. A 9mm Glock, if she wasn't mistaken. We're here for your valuables. Jewelry, cash, anything worth taking. You're going to tell us where they are and then we're going to leave. Simple as that. I'm afraid it's never quite that simple. Margaret's voice remained maddeningly calm. But I appreciate the straightforward approach. Derek, is it? The effect was like an electric shock. Derek actually took a step backward, his gun hand wavering slightly. Kyle made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a whimper. Even Travis, who had maintained his composure up to this point, went rigid. How did you... Derek started. To know your name. I heard your colleagues use it. Kyle and Travis, correct? It's important to know who I'm speaking with. She looked at each of them in turn, her gaze steady and unnervingly direct. Though I must say, Derek, your operational security is abysmal. Using real names during a crime? That's first-year mistake territory. Shut up. Derek's voice had taken on a harder edge, the edge of a man whose control of a situation was slipping and who knew it. I don't care what you heard. You're going to... I'm 72 years old. Margaret interrupted him gently, as if explaining something to a confused child. I live alone in this modest house in a middle-class neighborhood. I draw a social security check and a small pension. My car is 15 years old. My wardrobe consists primarily of items purchased at department store sales. She spread her hands in a gesture of openness. What exactly were you expecting to find here that would make breaking into an occupied home worth the risk? The question hung in the air. It was a good question, actually, one that Derek should have asked himself during the planning stages of this invasion. Margaret could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, could see him trying to regain the psychological advantage. Old people hide cash, keep jewelry from when they were younger. You'd be surprised what we find. Would I? Margaret tilted her head slightly, a gesture that was simultaneously curious and unsettling. Tell me, Derek, how many homes have you broken into this month? I'm genuinely curious about your success rate. That's none of your... because based on your methodology, I would estimate your returns are fairly modest. Breaking windows creates noise and evidence. Working in a group of 3 means splitting the proceeds. Targeting occupied homes increases your legal liability dramatically if caught, and your surveillance techniques... She shook her head with what appeared to be genuine disappointment. Well, I noticed you 3 days ago. If I noticed, others certainly did as well. Kyle was staring at her, as if she had just sprouted a second head. Derek, man, something's wrong here. This isn't normal. Old people are supposed to be scared. I am scared. Margaret's response was immediate and completely believable. Her voice trembled slightly, her hands shook in her lap. Her eyes widened with fear. 3 men with a gun broke into my home. I'm terrified. But then, just as quickly, the trembling stopped. The fear vanished from her eyes like a switch had been flipped. Her voice returned to its previous calm, conversational tone. I'm also a consummate actor when the situation requires it. Fear is simply an emotional response, and all emotional responses can be controlled with proper training. In that moment, the dynamic in the room shifted fundamentally. The 3 men who had entered Margaret Hartwell's home believing themselves to be predators had just glimpsed something that challenged that assumption. They were looking at an elderly woman who showed no fear, who spoke to them as if she were the one in control, who seemed entirely unconcerned about the gun pointing in her direction. "Training?" Travis spoke for the first time since entering the living room. "What kind of training?" Margaret smiled. It was not a comforting expression. "The kind that's going to make this a very long night for all of you. What's your opinion on what you've seen so far? Because I can promise you this is just the beginning. The real psychological warfare hasn't even started yet. Stay with us." Derek stepped forward, pressing the gun toward Margaret with renewed aggression. "Listen, Grandma, I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but it's not a game, Derek." Margaret's interruption was soft but carried absolute authority. "Games have winners and losers. This is something else entirely. This is an educational experience for all of us." She gestured to the sofa opposite her chair. "Why don't the three of you sit down? You've had a stressful evening, breaking and entering, dealing with unexpected complications. You must be tired. We're not sitting down." But Derek's voice carried less certainty than his words suggested. "Suit yourself. Though I should mention that standing for prolonged periods while engaged in high-stress situations increases fatigue and reduces cognitive function. It's why interrogators prefer to remain seated while their subjects stand. It's about power dynamics, you see. The person sitting always has a psychological advantage over the person standing, but then you probably don't have much experience with interrogation techniques." Kyle was shifting his weight from foot to foot, clearly unsettled. "Derek, I don't like this. Something's really wrong. We should just go. We're not leaving empty-handed." Derek's jaw was tight, his scar standing out white against flushed skin. "Search the house. Tear this place apart if you have to." "By all means." Margaret gestured expansively. "You'll find approximately $400 in my bedroom dresser, top drawer, beneath some old scarves. There's a jewelry box on my bathroom counter containing items worth perhaps $300 at a pawn shop, though the sentimental value is considerably higher. My late husband's wedding ring is there as well, gold, probably worth another $200. She paused, watching their faces. "Is that what you came for? $900 split three ways, $300 each minus whatever Derek takes off the top as the leader? Was it worth the felony charges?" The specificity of her answers, the casual way she offered information they were supposed to extract through threat and intimidation, was deeply disorienting. Travis and Kyle exchanged glances, both clearly out of their depth, but Margaret wasn't finished. "Derek, before you send your friends to search, perhaps you should tell them about the last home invasion you participated in, the one in Richmond, approximately 18 months ago, the one that went considerably worse than you planned." The color drained from Derek's face. The gun in his hand trembled just slightly. "How's—" He couldn't finish the question. "You're wondering how I could possibly know about that. It's a reasonable question." Margaret's voice had taken on a different quality now, still calm but underlaid with something harder, more clinical. "Tell me, Derek, do you still have nightmares about it? About the homeowner who fought back? About the way everything went wrong so quickly?" "I don't know what you're talking about." But the denial was weak, unconvincing. "Of course you do. It's why you have that scar on your jaw. The homeowner hit you with something, a lamp, I believe, before you and your partners subdued him. You thought you had good intelligence. You thought the house would be empty. You were wrong. And a man ended up in the hospital with critical injuries." She tilted her head, studying him. "They never caught you for that one, did they? Must weigh on you. The knowledge that you nearly killed someone." Kyle had gone pale. "Derek, is that true?" "Shut up." Derek swung toward his partner, momentarily taking his attention off Margaret. "Kyle Thompson." Margaret's voice cut through the tension like a blade. 26 years old. You started using opioids after a car accident 3 years ago. The prescription ran out, but the addiction didn't. That's what this is really about for you, isn't it? You need money for pills, for the relief they provide from both physical pain and the crushing weight of decisions you regret. Kyle's eyes went wide. "How do you know my last name? How do you know about—" "And Travis Brennan?" Margaret's gaze shifted to the third man, who had remained silent, standing slightly apart from the others. The quiet one, the planner, You're actually the most dangerous person in this room, aren't you, Travis? Because you don't do this out of desperation or addiction. You do it because you're good at it. Because you studied criminal justice in college before you dropped out. Because you understand exactly how the system works and how to exploit its weaknesses. Travis's expression had gone completely neutral, which told Margaret everything she needed to know. She had hit the mark. This is impossible. Kyle's voice was rising toward panic. She can't know this stuff. She can't know our names. Derek, we need to leave right now. Nobody's leaving. But Derek's command lacked conviction. Margaret leaned forward slightly in her chair. Gentlemen, let me explain what's happening here. You've made certain assumptions about me based on external appearances. Elderly, female, living alone. In your assessment, that made me vulnerable, an easy target. But you failed to conduct adequate research. You failed to ask yourselves why an obviously intelligent woman in her 70s would be living alone in this particular house, in this particular neighborhood. She gestured around the room, to the photographs on the walls, the books on the shelves, the carefully maintained space. You didn't notice that many of these photographs were taken in countries you probably couldn't locate on a map. You didn't observe that the books on my shelves include titles on criminal psychology, interrogation techniques, and intelligence methodology. You didn't wonder why a woman of my age and apparent means would choose to live modestly in a middle-class neighborhood rather than a retirement community or near family. Margaret stood slowly, a movement that immediately drew all three men to rigid attention. She was several inches shorter than any of them, visibly aged, objectively no physical threat whatsoever. Yet the space seemed to contract around her, her presence suddenly dominating the room. I spent 30 years asking questions for a living, extracting information from individuals who had been trained to resist interrogation, individuals who represented genuine threats to national security. Do you understand what I'm telling you? You're lying. Derek's voice was hoarse. Am I? Derek Mitchell released from Fort Hood with a general discharge in 2018 after assault charges that were ultimately dropped. Kyle Thompson, 3 prior arrests for possession, 2 convictions, 18 months served in total. Travis Brennan, no criminal record because you've never been caught. But you've been doing this for 6 years, haven't you? Small jobs, carefully selected targets, always working with different partners, so no patterns emerge. The silence that followed was suffocating. All 3 men were staring at her now with expressions that had progressed from confusion to something closer to fear. This is the part, Margaret continued conversationally, where you start to understand that you didn't break into a random house. You walked into something you weren't prepared for, and now you have to decide what to do about it. We leave. Kyle was already backing toward the hallway. We leave right now and forget this ever happened. Kyle's right. Travis's calm voice had finally cracked. This is wrong. This whole thing is wrong. I don't know what she is, but we need to go. She's bluffing. Derek was still trying to hold on to control, but Margaret could see the doubt eating away at his certainty. She's making guesses, trying to scare us. It's all psychological. Yes. Margaret's interjection was sharp. Yes, Derek, it is all psychological. That's exactly my point. And you're losing. She moved toward them, not quickly, not threateningly, just a simple step forward. All 3 men retreated a corresponding step. For 30 years I sat across tables from men who had killed, men who had planned attacks, men who believed their cause was worth any sacrifice, men far more dangerous and far more committed than the 3 of you will ever be. And do you know what I learned? Everyone breaks. Everyone has a pressure point. Everyone has a fear that, when properly exploited, will cause them to give up anything I need. We're leaving. Kyle had reached the hallway. I'm not listening to this anymore. This is insane. Kyle, wait. Derek's command was desperate now, but Kyle didn't wait. He turned and ran, his footsteps echoing through the house toward the broken kitchen window. And then came the sound that changed everything, a voice from the kitchen, calm and official. This is the Alexandria Police Department. The house is surrounded. Put down any weapons and come out with your hands visible. Kyle's scream of surprise and fear was audible throughout the entire house. Travis cursed viciously, looking wildly between Margaret and the hallway. She called the cops. She called them before we even got here. Did I? Margaret's expression was unreadable. Or did one of my neighbors hear that window break and do their civic duty? Or perhaps one of you triggered a silent alarm at some point during your exploration of my home? So many possibilities. Derek pointed the gun directly at her head, his hand now shaking visibly. You set us up. This whole thing was always going to end one way. Margaret's voice remained steady, even with a firearm pointed at her face. You chose to break into this house. You chose to threaten me. You chose every step that brought you to this moment. I simply made sure that when you made those choices, the consequences would be appropriate. The sound of breaking wood came from the front of the house. The police weren't waiting. Travis dropped to his knees, hands behind his head, assuming the position with the efficiency of someone who had done this before. Kyle was screaming something incoherent from the kitchen. Derek stood frozen, the gun still pointed at Margaret, his face a mask of rage and despair and cornered animal fear. Derek. Margaret spoke his name gently, almost kindly. You need to put the gun down right now, because if you don't, this goes from burglary to assault with a deadly weapon, possibly attempted murder. You're looking at years either way, but this decision determines whether it's 5 years or 20. Make the smart choice. For a long moment, Derek didn't move. Margaret could see him processing, calculating, trying to find a way out that didn't exist. Then the gun lowered. His arm went limp. The weapon clattered to the floor. Hands behind your head. On your knees. Derek complied slowly, his eyes never leaving Margaret's face. In those eyes she saw the question he couldn't articulate. What are you? As police flooded into the house, as flashlights and shouted commands filled the space that had been so quiet moments before, Margaret Hartwell stood perfectly still in her living room, watching 3 men being taken into custody. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction, no sense of victory. Only the hollow ache that had followed her throughout her career, the knowledge that she had used her skills, her training, her psychological expertise to dismantle other human beings, even criminals who had threatened her home. An officer approached her, young, concerned, asking if she was all right, if she needed medical attention. She assured him she was fine, just shaken, so grateful the police had arrived in time. She played the role perfectly. Frightened, elderly woman, lucky to be alive. But as she watched Derek being led out of her house in handcuffs, she saw him mouth 2 words. Thank you. And she knew he had understood something essential in those final moments. She could have done far worse to him than simply calling the police. I want to thank you so much for staying with this story until now. You've witnessed something incredible, and I promise you, the best is yet to come. The real revelations are just ahead. Keep watching. The Alexandria police station at 4:30 in the morning was a study in institutional fluorescence and barely restrained chaos. Officers moved through hallways with practiced efficiency, processing the aftermath of a home invasion that had gone spectacularly wrong for everyone involved except the intended victim. In interview room C, Detective Sarah Chen sat across from Derek Mitchell, studying the file in front of her with an expression that managed to be both bored and intensely focused. Derek had refused a lawyer initially, a decision he was beginning to deeply regret. So let me make sure I understand this correctly. Chen's voice was flat, neutral. You broke into the home of a 72-year-old woman. She was awake when you arrived. She sat in the dark and waited for you. Then she proceeded to tell you details about your personal lives that should have been impossible for her to know. And when you decided to leave, we were already surrounding the house. Derek said nothing. He had said almost nothing since being arrested, primarily because he genuinely didn't understand what had happened in that house. Here's what's interesting. Chen flipped a page in her file. Margaret Hartwell called 911 at exactly 1:43 a.m. That's 34 minutes before you broke her kitchen window. She reported suspicious activity in her neighborhood and requested a patrol car check the area. The responding officers observed your vehicle parked 2 blocks away and decided to maintain surveillance. When they heard glass breaking, they called for backup and surrounded the house. Derek's head came up. She called before we even got there. She knew you were coming. Chen leaned back in her chair, which raises some fascinating questions. How did a retired woman living alone know that 3 men were planning to break into her home that specific night? I don't know. Derek's voice was hoarse, exhausted. I don't know anything about her. She's not... She's not normal. Define normal. Normal old people are scared, they panic, they hide. She just sat there like she was waiting, like she wanted us to break in. Derek ran his hands through his hair, the motion jerky with suppressed panic. She knew our names. She knew things about us. Personal things, things nobody should know. Chen made a note. What kind of things? About the Richmond job, about Kyle's drug problem, about Travis's background, specific details, not just guesses. Derek looked directly at the detective. Who is she? Really? She's a retired civil servant who worked for the federal government for 30 years. Beyond that, her employment records are classified. Chen's expression didn't change, but something in her tone suggested she had hit similar walls in her own research. I called my supervisor at 3 a.m. to ask about this. He made some calls. He told me to conduct a standard investigation, take your statements, and not ask questions about Ms. Hartwell's background. That's insane. That's how classified employment works. Chen closed her file. You're being charged with breaking and entering, attempted burglary, possession of a firearm during commission of a felony, and criminal trespass. Your partners are being charged similarly. Given your prior record and the Richmond case, oh yes, we know about that now, she gave us quite a helpful tip, you're looking at substantial prison time. Derek slumped in his chair, the reality of his situation finally penetrating. She destroyed us. In 15 minutes, she completely destroyed us. She defended her home against 3 intruders. Chen's voice carried no sympathy. From where I'm sitting, she did exactly what any intelligent person would do. She recognized surveillance, anticipated the threat, called the police, and kept you talking until we arrived. The only mystery is how she knew so much about you. She interrogated us. Derek's voice was hollow. That's what it was. We thought we were in control, thought we had the power because we had numbers and a weapon. But from the moment she spoke, we weren't in control at all. She was running the whole thing like we were subjects in an experiment. Maybe you were. Chen stood, gathering her files. Maybe that's exactly what you were. Down the hallway in interview room A, Kyle Thompson was having a complete breakdown. His officer-assigned lawyer sat beside him, taking notes and looking increasingly concerned as Kyle rambled through tears and mounting withdrawal symptoms. She knew about my accident. She knew about the pills. She knew my full name, my age, things I never told anyone. How is that possible? How did she know? Kyle's voice was rising toward hysteria. And the way she looked at us, like she could see inside our heads, like she knew exactly what we were thinking. Kyle, I need you to calm down and focus. The lawyer, a public defender named Martinez, who had seen a lot in 15 years of practice, was genuinely unsettled by his client's state. What exactly did Miss Hartwell say to you? She said I was 26, that I got addicted after a car accident, that I need money for pills. That's not just lucky guessing, that's specific. That's... Kyle dissolved into sobs. I thought we were going to rob an old lady. Easy score. Travis said she'd be easy. He said she was perfect. He's the one who picked her. He watched her for days before we even got involved. Martinez sat up straighter. Travis selected the target? Yeah, he does that. He picks the houses, figures out the schedules, plans everything. Derek just handles the physical stuff. I'm just there because I owe Derek money, and he said this would clear the debt. Kyle was talking faster now, the words spilling out in a desperate rush to unburden himself. But Travis knew her somehow, he must have. He acted like he didn't, but when she said his full name, when she talked about his background, he didn't look surprised. He looked caught. Martinez made extensive notes, his mind already racing through implications. If one of the perpetrators had specifically targeted this woman, if there had been some prior connection, the entire case became far more complex. In interview room B, Travis Brennan sat in absolute silence. He had requested a lawyer immediately upon arrest and had not said a single word since. His hands were folded calmly on the table in front of him. His expression was neutral. His breathing was controlled. But behind that carefully maintained exterior, his mind was working frantically. He had made a catastrophic error. Not in selecting Margaret Hartwell as a target. That decision had been calculated, deliberate, based on specific information he had acquired. His error was in underestimating her. 6 months ago, Travis had been working as a security consultant for a firm that contracted with various government agencies. It was legitimate work, well-paying, boring. He had maintained it as a cover while conducting his more profitable illegal activities on the side. During that period, he had glimpsed a name in a classified document he wasn't supposed to see. Margaret Hartwell, former CIA officer, retired, living in Alexandria. The document had been about something else entirely, but that name had caught his attention. Former intelligence officers often maintained access to resources, had money hidden away, possessed valuables acquired during years of overseas service. More importantly, they were trained to not draw attention to themselves, which meant they were unlikely to have extensive security systems or close relationships with local police. In Travis's assessment, Margaret Hartwell had seemed like the perfect target. High reward, low risk. He had conducted surveillance, confirmed she lived alone, appeared vulnerable, maintained a predictable routine. What he had failed to consider was that intelligence officers were also trained in exactly the kinds of skills that would make them dangerous in precisely this scenario. She had recognized his surveillance immediately. She had probably identified him specifically. She had called the police before they even arrived. And then, most damningly, she had psychologically dismantled all three of them in a matter of minutes. Travis had studied criminal psychology. He understood interrogation techniques. He recognized what she had done because he had read about those exact tactics in textbooks. She had exploited group dynamics, created suspicion between the three men, revealed specific information that made them doubt each other, and question how she could possibly know what she knew. It was textbook psychological warfare, and it had worked perfectly. The question now was what she intended to do with the information she had, because during those 15 minutes in her house, Travis had realized with growing horror that Margaret Hartwell knew far more than she had revealed. She had known his full name, his educational background, his operational methodology. She had looked at him and seen everything. If she chose to share that information with the authorities, if she had documentation or evidence of his other jobs, the ones that had never been connected to him, he was facing far more than just this single burglary charge. He was facing the end of everything. The door to the interview room opened. A woman entered, late 40s, professional attire, federal credentials on her belt. She wasn't local police. Travis's stomach dropped. "Mr. Brennan, I'm Special Agent Roberts, FBI. I'd like to talk to you about some other residences you may have visited over the past 6 years." And Travis Brennan, who had maintained perfect composure through his arrest, through processing, through the hours of waiting, finally broke. His hands began to shake. His breathing became shallow. Because he understood exactly what had happened. Margaret Hartwell hadn't just defended her home. She had conducted an operation. She had extracted information from 3 criminals, identified their methodologies, and provided federal authorities with everything they needed to unravel years of unsolved cases. 3 men had broken into her house. They had never stood a chance. This story is almost at its end. But you need to stay until the very last word to understand how this all truly resolves. If you've made it this far, you're clearly invested in this incredible tale. So please, hit that subscribe button and leave a like right now. You don't want to miss the powerful conclusion and the other amazing stories coming to this channel. Trust me, the ending will tie everything together in ways you can't anticipate. 3 weeks later, Margaret Hartwell sat in a small cafe in Georgetown, watching the Potomac River flow past through rain-streaked windows. Across from her sat a man in his 50s, silver-haired, wearing an unremarkable suit that somehow managed to suggest authority without drawing attention. "You couldn't have just called the police immediately?" David Mercer had been Margaret's handler during her final 5 years at the agency. He had retired 2 years before she did, but they maintained irregular contact. Mostly he checked on her, made sure retirement was treating her well. Today he looked more exasperated than concerned. Where would be the educational value in that? Margaret sipped her coffee, watching his reaction with amusement. 3 criminals broke into my home, David. I saw an opportunity. An opportunity to do what, exactly? Traumatize them. To teach them a lesson they'll remember. She set down her cup. Derek Mitchell is cooperating fully with prosecutors. He's providing information on 6 other jobs, accepting responsibility, and has agreed to a plea deal that includes mandatory rehabilitation. Kyle Thompson is in a treatment program, covered by a plea agreement that requires him to testify against his previous dealers. And Travis Brennan. She paused, a slight smile playing at her lips. Travis is helping the FBI close 43 unsolved burglaries across 4 states. David stared at her. You orchestrated all of that in 15 minutes? I planted the seeds. Law enforcement did the actual work. I simply provided them with the right questions to ask and enough information to make those questions compelling. She looked out the window. Those 3 men were on a trajectory toward increasingly serious crimes. Derek was becoming violent. Kyle was funding a dangerous addiction. Travis was refining his methodology toward more sophisticated targets. Without intervention, someone was going to end up seriously hurt. So you decided to intervene, using techniques that are supposed to be reserved for enemies of the state. Are criminals who break into homes not enemies in their own way? Margaret's voice was quiet, but firm. I didn't hurt them, David. I didn't torture them. I didn't even threaten them, not really. I simply made them understand that their assumptions about power and vulnerability were dangerously wrong. David was quiet for a long moment, processing. Finally, he shook his head with something between admiration and resignation. You know there are going to be questions about how a retired civil servant managed to extract that much information that quickly, about what kind of training would enable someone to psychologically deconstruct 3 armed men without breaking a sweat. Let people ask questions. My service record is classified. I'm a harmless old woman who got lucky. She met his eyes. Isn't that the official line? That's the official line. He paused. Are you doing all right, really? It was the question beneath the question. Was she experiencing PTSD? Was she having trouble adjusting to civilian life? Had confronting those men triggered something from her past that required intervention? I'm fine. Margaret's answer was honest. Better than fine, actually. For the first time since I retired, I felt like myself again, like the skills I spent 3 decades developing still had purpose. She smiled, but it was tinged with melancholy. The hardest part of retirement isn't the lack of action. It's the feeling that everything you knew, everything you were good at, is no longer relevant, that you're just waiting to fade away. You're 72, Margaret. You've earned the right to fade away if you want to. I don't want to. She said it simply, a statement of fact. I want to matter. I want my experience to count for something. David studied her face, reading the determination there. You know there's a program, consulting work for retired officers, training new recruits, reviewing case files, advising on interrogation strategies. It's part-time, flexible, and it would make use of your expertise. Margaret's interest was immediate and obvious. Tell me more. 2 months after that conversation, Margaret Hartwell walked into a training facility in Northern Virginia, carrying a briefcase and wearing professional attire that made her look like anyone's kindly grandmother headed to a book club meeting. The 23 recruits in the classroom had been told only that they would be meeting with a retired officer who would discuss real-world applications of interrogation techniques. Most were expecting someone military, someone obviously formidable. When Margaret walked in, several of them exchanged glances. This was their expert instructor. Margaret set down her briefcase and looked out at the young faces staring at her with poorly concealed skepticism. She smiled. Good morning. Before we begin, I want to tell you a story about 3 men who broke into my home 2 months ago. They had numbers. They had a weapon. They had every tactical advantage. They thought they were in control. She paused, letting the silence build. By the time law enforcement arrived 15 minutes later, they were begging to be arrested. They provided information that closed dozens of cases. They accepted plea deals that will alter the trajectory of their entire lives. And they never laid a finger on me. Now she had their complete attention. The question I want you to consider is, how? How does an unarmed woman in her 70s neutralize 3 violent criminals without physical confrontation? The answer to that question is why you're here. Because the most powerful weapon you will ever carry isn't a gun or a knife or any physical object. It's your mind. And over the next 6 weeks, I'm going to teach you how to use it. The classroom was absolutely silent. 23 recruits who had entered with skepticism were now leaning forward, riveted. And Margaret Hartwell, who had spent 7 years in retirement, feeling invisible and irrelevant, was finally home. On a Tuesday evening, 3 months later, Margaret hosted dinner at her house on Colvin Street. Her daughter had driven down from Boston with the grandchildren. Her son had flown in from Seattle. The kitchen window had been repaired. The house showed no signs of the incident that had occurred there. Over roasted chicken and her grandmother's recipe for potatoes, Margaret listened to her daughter talk about work, watched her grandchildren demonstrate some complicated game on their phones, heard her son discuss his recent promotion. Normal family conversation, normal life. Her daughter caught her eye at one point, concern flickering across her face. "Mum, are you sure you're okay here? After what happened? We could find you a place with better security, or you could move closer to one of us. I'm exactly where I need to be." Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. "This is my home, and I'm more capable of defending it than anyone gives me credit for." After dinner, after the dishes were cleaned and her family had headed to their hotel for the night, Margaret sat in her living room in the same chair where she had waited for 3 criminals to break in. She thought about the strange paths life takes, about how the skills we develop don't stop being valuable just because we stop using them professionally, about how vulnerability is often a mask worn by those who are anything but. She thought about Derek, Kyle, and Travis, all of whom had written her letters from prison or treatment facilities. They had been awkward letters, uncertain in tone, but all expressing a similar sentiment: thank you. Thank you for not hurting us worse than you could have. Thank you for giving us a chance at a different path. Thank you for teaching us that we weren't as smart or as powerful as we thought we were. She had responded to each letter. She had offered encouragement, resources, and the simple message that people were capable of change if they chose it. And she thought about the recruits she was training, young men and women who were learning the same skills she had mastered decades ago, who would go on to protect their country using minds as much as muscle. Margaret Hartwell had spent 30 years in the shadows, asking questions that shaped history, extracting secrets that saved lives. She had retired believing that chapter was closed. But she had been wrong. The chapter wasn't closed. It had simply evolved into something new. She was still asking questions, still teaching, still using decades of experience to make the world slightly safer, one interaction at a time. And if anyone ever broke into her home again, well, they would learn the same lesson those 3 men had learned. The most dangerous opponent is never the one who looks dangerous. It's the one you underestimate. Margaret smiled to herself in the quiet of her home, feeling more at peace than she had in years. She had found her purpose again, and it felt like coming home. So there you have it, the incredible story of how 3 criminals walked into what they thought was an easy target and encountered a woman whose mind was a weapon they never saw coming. Margaret Hartwell proved that strength doesn't fade with age, that experience is its own kind of power, and that the greatest battles are often won without a single physical blow being struck. What did you think of this story? Could you have remained as calm as Margaret in that situation? What would you have done differently? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And please, tell us your name and what city and state you're watching from. I love connecting with viewers from all over and seeing how far these stories travel. If this story moved you, inspired you, or left you on the edge of your seat, please hit that subscribe button right now. We have so many more incredible stories coming your way, tales of ordinary people who displayed extraordinary courage, intelligence, and resilience in the face of impossible odds. Don't miss out on the next chapter, and before you go, make sure to watch the next recommended video appearing on your screen right now. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Until next time, remember, never underestimate the power of the human mind and never judge strength by appearances alone.